First of all, let me thank Brad for inviting me and including myself with this body of really distinguished scholars. And it's always a pleasure to follow Dermot and try and add something, which is oftentimes very difficult. So I'm going to take because I can't add anything, I'm going to try and take a slightly different tact and focus a bit more on both market fundamentals and talk about the role of speculation. And I'm going to try and avoid any predictions. Even with my gray hair, I've now lived long enough to see many of my previous predictions totally invalidated. So what do I want to do today? What I want to do is talk about three aspects of oil markets and some of the research that I've been doing. One is I want to talk about the role of fundamentals in setting oil prices. And I want to talk about this idea that's become popular recently, that there was this demand shock, and literally if you go back through the history of the oil market starting in the 70s, that there were no real supply shocks, that really what we were witnessing were demand shocks. And I'm referring to a paper that appeared in the American Economic Review. I'm going to try and argue that that's really not the case, and that, to use the monetarist phrase, oil price shocks are always a supply-side phenomenon, not a demand-side phenomenon, and I'll give some of that evidence. Then I want to talk about the role of speculation may have played in recent oil price increases. Oh, the other thing is there a clock somewhere here? I've got a... Well, I need to... Can I just borrow it? So people off screen, you're not missing much. So when do I have to? 9:45. Okay. So I just want to make sure I get through what I want to. So I'm going to point to three pieces of evidence that I really think indicate that speculation played a role in both the 2008 price spike, but also something that we Americans don't complain a lot about, the 2008-2009 price collapse, that in both cases prices went beyond what you would expect based on market fundamentals. And then I want to talk a little bit about some new research that I'm doing with the European Central Bank, where we're explicitly trying to link what went on in the oil market to the role of commercial traders and non-commercial traders in setting prices or in influencing prices. So let me start with this idea of a demand shock. So this is a response to a paper, a very clever paper, in which the author tried to measure demand-side responses or oil demand, and without monthly data for oil demand and without getting into the econometrics of it and the simultaneity, he developed a very interesting index for measuring kind of economic activity on a monthly basis globally, and that was to measure the cost of shipping goods around the world, various prices. And what he did was he took that data for the cost of shipping a ton of material around the world, and he fit a time trend to it to get rid of, changes over time. And this is all in logged versions. And then he plotted the residuals. And that line or that data is represented by this yellow line. And you can see from about 2004 to about 2008, there was a rapid spike in that index. And he used this index to argue, based upon an econometric analysis, that really it was demand-side forces that had generated price shocks in the recent 20-year and 30-year period. Well, I got to confess, I'm a supply-side guy, and I was relatively dubious of this, especially when I went back and looked at the data for oil demand globally. And when you look at that data, there is no evidence of a supply shock. Demand grows at pretty much the same rate for the last 20 years. And that's what I have here. This red line represents, I've taken the log of oil demand, I've fit a time trend to it, and then I've taken the residual. And so you see the residual of this trend is fairly constant. That is, there's no demand shock here when you look at the demand data. What's going on here? Why is this the case? And I'm noticing some puzzled looks. Yes, oil demand in China grew very rapidly during that period, but elsewhere in the world, oil demand actually shrank, and so on net, global oil demand does not grow very rapidly. So how did he get this result? And I'm going to argue that he got this result by kind of loading the dice. And he made what I consider an error in the measure he used to represent oil prices. So what he used was the refiner's acquisition cost for oil. That is the price of oil that refineries pay for oil delivered to the refinery. And what's important about that price is it includes transportation costs. So right there, there's a built-in link between his measure of oil demand, which is based upon the cost of transporting goods around the world, and this measure of oil prices. To make matters even worse, there's a very important dynamic going on in transportation markets and shipping markets, and it looks something like the following. What I have here is the world oil price in green, and by the way, this graph is from the Department of Agriculture. It's I'm sure it's a publication everybody reads. It's the Container Shipping Monthly. And by the way, I want to make it, let me step back 1 second here, and that is, I was trained as a natural scientist, and so what I'm going to present here are analyses of real-world data as supplied by DOE and IEA using econometric techniques. So whatever I say, I'm going to try and back up with some statistical evidence, even though I'm going to try and avoid boring you with actual statistical results. So what's important here is, here's the world oil price, and this blue line is a fuel surcharge. Every time the price of oil goes up, shippers add a fuel surcharge to the cost of shipping their goods around. And so one of the arguments I'm going to try and make here is, of course there's this relationship between world oil prices and this measure of oil demand, but it results from this kind of relationship between world oil prices and fuel surcharges that are tacked on to the cost of shipping goods around the world. And the ultimate evidence for that is right here. Now, I apologize in advance, this is the only table of statistical results. But the idea is, one of the things in statistics that's very hard to disentangle is cause and effect. And a man named Clive Granger won a Nobel Prize in 2003 in economics for a methodology that allows us to try and, at least at first glance, disentangle cause and effect. And when we look at it, when we look at the data actually used in that paper, we find that in all measures of oil prices, that the price of oil, Granger causes that shipping index. So in other words, it's totally consistent with the idea that world oil prices go up, shipping companies add a fuel surcharge, and that then shows up in the price of shipping goods and services around. What's interesting is here, that is, there's a relationship from the shipping cost to price when you have the refiner's acquisition cost that includes the cost of shipping goods around. But when you eliminate that cost of shipping goods around, that causal relationship disappears. In other words, the demand shocks that he's attributing to this shipping index are really the other way around. When oil prices increase, you get this shock in the cost of shipping goods around. So hopefully that will eliminate that argument, or at least undermine that argument about demand. Let me go to the supply side. So what I have here is OPEC production and non-OPEC production since 1960, and I want to draw your eye here to 2004, something that Dept talked about, and that is starting in 2004, after many years of steady increases, again, this is the collapse of the former Soviet Union, all of a sudden, oil production by non-OPEC countries stops growing. And what's interesting is, as Dermot said, you can actually go back in time and look at what the US government was saying as to what was going to happen to non-OPEC production. And in 2004, their forecast was by 2010, there would be an additional 9 million barrels per day in production. So in other words, it should have been up here by now. And clearly it's not. So this lack of increase took the market by surprise. And that, I'm going to try and argue, is one of the most important points in the rise in oil prices that really starts in about 2004. How am I going to make this argument? To make this argument, I really want to go back and talk a little bit about how it is that OPEC really is able to influence the world oil market and the timing of that sea change that Dermot talked about for 1971. What I have here are two sets of data. One, the yellow line is capacity utilization allowed to operate by the Texas Railroad Commission. So once upon a time, and Oklahoma had its own commission as well, what would happen is on a monthly basis, the members of the Texas Railroad Commission would meet. They would decide at what rate they would allow the operators in Texas to pump their fields so that supply and demand would match and oil prices would be relatively stable.